I know I'm doing 2 Donna Tartt videos in a month, but if you guys could refrain from attaching this to my personal brand, that would be great. Hey friends, it's Hawk. Today I'm going to be doing my first full-length review, hence the change in scenery, and I feel that it's probably appropriate that that review is going to be on The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt. For those of you who don't know, The Goldfinch is about a boy named Theo who loses his mother in a museum bombing, and in his trauma and head injury induced haze, he grabs a very famous painting from the museum bombing called The Goldfinch, and it follows his life from I think about 13 to 20. He's in his 20s. So this review is going to be spoiler free relatively. When I get into some of the more problematic issues about this book, I think I may slip in some vague facts. So the first thing that I want to talk about in this book is the writing. I am a simp for Donna Tartt's writing. I'm sorry to say it. I just think that she has such a powerful writing style, and it's something that is always going to draw me in about her books, regardless of any of the other content. As long as she is the one writing it, it kind of has to hold a high place in my heart. This is really the only thing about the novel that I have no complaints about. I think she just breathes life into descriptions, into her philosophizing. Yeah, I just really think it's great. And I wouldn't, be doing a review if I didn't give you a quote to exemplify that. Right, I said, looking down at the labyrinth at the foot of the stairs. Blonde wood like honey, dark wood like poured molasses, gleams of brass and gilt and silver in the weak light. As with Noah's Ark, each species of furniture was ranked with its own kind. Chairs with chairs, settees with settees, clocks with clocks, desks and cabinets and highboys standing in stiff ranks opposite. Dining tables in the middle formed narrow, maze-like paths to be edged around. At the back of the room, a wall of tarnished old mirrors hung frame to frame, glowed with the silver light of old ballrooms and candlelit salons. I'm just there, Like, I can see it all, and that is just from a paragraph of description. I am deep in this man's workshop. I just love it. Moving on from that, because I could just talk about all the things I love about her writing all day, but this is not gonna be that kind of review, shockingly. So next I want to talk about the characters. So like with The Secret History, which, if you don't know by now, is my favorite book of all time, I think that Donna Tartt has a really canny way of creating characters that I'm going to think about long after I close the book. For this book we have Hobie, who is the kindly, eccentric caretaker of a antique shop who kind of takes in Theo. Then we have Boris, the shady Ukrainian best friend of Theo, who plays a very, very major part in this. Literally the epitome of chaotic energy. And then we have Pippa, the girl that the narrator is so entirely in love with he feels like he doesn't need to give us any description of her personality whatsoever, which is something I will get into later. These are just some of the main characters. There's a very large cast of characters in this book, which makes sense because it's almost 800 pages. But I think these characters, specifically the way that Theo describes them, unreliable as he is, I think that they are extremely thought-provoking. I know I already said that, but that's the best way to describe how I feel about most of Donna Tartt's characters. I feel like Tartt gives us a lot of room to think about their motivations and how they would be described, I guess, outside of Theo's very limited scope. What I think about the way that Theo views these people is that he tends to simplify people to their most basic trait, whether that be positive or negative. All of the more villainous characters are very villainous, and all of the good characters are very good. The only exception I would say to this is Boris. Boris is pretty complicated as a person, you could say, and I think Miss Barber also is a bit more complicated than simply good or bad, but Hobie definitely fits. Lucius, I can't remember what his last name is, but he is a villain in this series. He is very simply bad. And then Pippa obviously is just lovely. Lovely is her simplest trait, because we don't get any other pieces of her personality. Of course, all that said, it could be argued that I as a reader am making too many leaps. I'm filling in too many blanks for Donna Tartt, and that her characters should be complex on their own without, me adding details about them. And I mean, I can't argue with that. I've had a habit in my entire life, really, of projecting, not necessarily myself, but traits that I find would fit the character, or a background that may not necessarily actually be canon that I'm filling in. I think it's just because I'm a writer and I want to flesh out characters that I feel some kind of connection with, so I think that I do that a lot in Tart's books. I just think she provides a really interesting framework, but I can see where people are coming from when they say that she doesn't create the characters as complexly as she should. So I completely validate that argument, and you may find it, that's why I'm saying it here, you may find when you read The Goldfinch or even The Secret History that the characters don't come off as complex to you the way that they do to me. I can't really separate my reading from the extrapolations that I've made about these characters, specifically for The Goldfinch, more so with The Secret History. I would have to read The Goldfinch again in order to separate what I have created in my head based on what's actually in the text, and I'm not going to be rereading The Goldfinch anytime soon, so. Now let's talk briefly about the main character. I just find him probably the most uninteresting part, similar to The Secret History, and if you saw my video on The Secret History a few weeks ago, you would know that unreliable narrators are some of my favorite things to read about, and Theo is unreliable, but in a different way from Richard from The Secret History. He is a blackout drunk, he's an alcoholic, he's a druggie, and he also has a lot of trauma that is going from being part of this bombing and all the other shit that happens to him throughout the novel. Honestly, I just think that it is a less interesting, I hate to compare to The Secret History, but she like reuses so many of the tricks that she used in The Secret History, such as the unreliable narrator, that I think that it's fair to compare them. I just find it less of a compelling story to read than if you like compare it to the unreliable narrator in The Secret History, who was glorifying these people, and it was more about that than him just simply not remembering things that happened. I don't really have that many feelings about Theo, which is probably a problem. He is our main character, and for me to not care about him as a person, or I'm not angry at him. I don't particularly feel protective towards him. I definitely feel bad for him in some parts, but like as a character, I think that he is really not that interesting or compelling. It's weird because he feels like a side character in his own story because he is like the least interesting, but that could be something with like the writing style, something Tart was doing on purpose, but I didn't really read it that way. Take it as you will. Yeah, I feel like it kind of sucks when your narrator isn't particularly interesting. So let's talk briefly about the plot. I'd say briefly because plot, I feel like I've mentioned it before on this channel, but it is just, I just don't care. As long as it is something that I am able to follow, I don't really care if I have to suspend my disbelief at all. Plot is probably the least important aspect of a novel for me. I don't know if that's an unpopular opinion. A lot of people do say though that this plot falls into the pretty messy category, that there is a lot of suspension of disbelief required, a lot of remembering the internet and then forgetting it exists in like important moments. Something I will say is that the pacing is really inconsistent with the plot. There are parts that are so fast it feels like I read them in like 15 minutes and I've been reading for an hour. But there are some parts it's like they got shot in the leg and they're just limping along. And I guess that is kind of understandable for how long of a book it is, but it didn't need to be this long, so that's something else I wanted to discuss too. This was too long of a book. I personally really do like long books. One of my favorite books is War and Peace. I like staying with the same characters for a long time. It's funny because I don't like series, but when it comes to long books, it's nice. That said, I do think any good editor would have taken a chainsaw to this book. Like there are so many sections, especially he at one point moves to Las Vegas and it is just, it's slow. It's slow going for quite a long time. And the last chapter is just almost unbearable. Like it's just him philosophizing. Goes on for so long and it's not even interesting for the vast majority. The last 2 pages are great in my opinion, but like everything else I'm like, when is this gonna be over? When is it gonna be over? It's just like you should not have to drag along the last chapter of your book, especially when it's already 771 pages. That's my opinion. Now that I have sort of basic story stuff out of the way, let's talk about the general problematic content of this book because it is plentiful. Let's start with the homophobia. It is not an uncommon belief that Theo, the main character, is a repressed homosexual, And a lot of this is supported by, you know, comments about being perceived as gay alongside comments that he makes about his best friend Boris and certain things that happen with Boris. However, it is not brought up at all or examined even slightly, so in my opinion, that is kind of what makes it a little problematic for me. Perhaps if this was a gay man writing this, I'm not trying to speculate on Donna Tartt's sexuality because I have no idea, but what I do know is that she's not a gay man, so it concerns me that a story, if this is what she was going for, but even if it wasn't, she was queer baiting, it concerns me that a repressed homosexual would be written by a straight woman, but that story thread is just never examined. It just makes me uncomfortable is the long and short of it, and I think that that's something to know going in, that you're gonna see a lot of that. I feel like she fell into the same trap with Richard from the last book, except it is way more pronounced in this book, so that made me uncomfortable, but not as uncomfortable as the racism. Donna Tartt uses the N-word twice in this book, both coming from Boris, and I think it was entirely unnecessary. We have already enough evidence to assume that Boris is a little bit of a problematic character, so we do not also need him saying the N-word. It really came off as shoehorned in, and maybe it wouldn't have if there wasn't also the whole not having any POC at all in this book. Oh, I'm sorry. Theo's doormen are Latino. Oh, and also we have Esperanza, the Latina maid, so silly me. Silly me, this book has so much representation. There were also these two social service workers, and they were both specifically described as being people of color. They're like a Korean lady and a Latino man. And now she can be like, look at these. I have characters of color right there. I don't know if Donna Tartt just finds people of color boring, or if she knows she's just too racist to write them well, but either way, it's way more pronounced in this book than it was in The Secret History. Like, oh god, I don't know how this book doesn't make people uncomfortable. It made me very uncomfortable. Next we have the misogyny. Donna Tartt seems allergic to actually writing complex female characters. She has written 3 novels, of which I've read 2, and none of the female characters are like complex at all. Like I said, Mrs. Barber kind of comes close, but Pippa is, like Camilla in The Secret History, completely reduced to Theo's fantasy, his idealizing of her. And then we have this girl Kitsy, who is his friend from childhood, his little sister, and she is just written as this like cold, unfeeling slut, basically. I think that if this problem shows up in one novel, it's a valid critique of the male gaze, but having it show up in 2 novels where the women just kind of get flattened and like removed of any complexity by the male narrator, I think that it becomes a problem. It's no longer a valid take on the male gaze, it's more like you just don't want to write complex women. And finally, we have the portrayal of Slavic people. Boris and his dad and the people that he surrounds himself with are all very shady. They're abusive alcoholics. It's like she was like, what group still has stereotypical ties to gang violence and just regular violence and alcoholism and general shadiness, but is not a person of color, because we don't have these in this book. Oh yeah, Slavic people. I mean, do with that what you will. It just kind of bothered me, and it was also just kind of funny. I was like, really? Is this what we're doing? So that is pretty much all my thoughts about The Goldfinch. I did initially give it 4 stars, but then I bumped it down to 3 the more that I thought about it, and the more that I think about it, the less that I like it. I think that I will read it again eventually. It's really just the writing that does it for me, because the plot, I didn't have any issue with it. I just really do think of plots as like vehicles for all the other things that I care about. I think that the initial premise is really good. I like Hobie. I like Boris for all of his issues. I just don't know if I'll ever know how I feel about this book. I think I'll have to read it a couple of times to really form a steadfast opinion on it, because I fluctuate with it. It's been 5 days, so I was like, I think that I have enough thoughts to film a review, but at the same time, I think that my opinion is apt to change the more I think about it. It's just it's a thinker. There's just a lot of content to think about in that book. So thank you all so much for joining me. This was my first full-length review, so take it with a grain of salt. I'm still trying to figure out like how to talk about the books that I love in any sort of long format. Really what I wanted to do was like get the word out about some of the like more problematic elements of this book that I feel like kind of just got bypassed. I didn't hear anything about it, so yeah. Thank you all so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye!
So they pull back, make other plans. I understand, I'm a liability. Get you wild, make